Hey everybody, we are joined by Richmond Williams, the Packers Director of Pro Personnel. Richmond, we hear these titles. I don't know that a lot of folks know exactly what they mean. What is the Director of Pro Personnel? What does that job entail?
Okay, so at its core, the basics of what we do is scouting the rest of the league. We want to know these teams as well as we know ourselves. A lot of that is when you start talking about trade opportunities and acquired players, like that is essentially what we do. That's the core of our process. As scouts, like we evaluate talent, whether you're doing college or pro, but what we do specifically is directed more towards not only our own roster, but studying the landscape of the rest of the NFL.
Could you talk about your path to becoming the Packers Director of Pro Personnel?
Yeah, it's been a long, winding road is how I would describe it. Started out 2007 as a training camp intern. I got my opportunity here through an internship, and I left here after camp was over, didn't hear anything. John Dorsey actually called me in the summer of 2008, told me that there was a contract in the mail. I could either sign it or I don't. I signed it, and for a lot of guys,
that sounds like Dorsey, pretty
100%.
blunt.
Yeah, a lot of guys, their start may be a little bit different. I kind of got thrown into the fire where they signed me up as an NFS scout, and that's the National Football Scouting. And essentially, we call that the Combine Scout. So every year, the Packers, organizationally, we try to have a guy in the Combine. And usually there's 20 plus teams that are affiliated with that, and there'll be 11 scouts from those 20 teams that will participate in that. So I did that from 2008 to 2012, and then got a promotion, obviously, that was post Super Bowl. You know, we had some guys leave, so there was just more opportunity to kind of have some upward mobility. And got my first promotion as an area scout, still scouting the same area, which would have been the Southwest at the time. And I did that until really the summer of 2017, where I got a phone call. They, presented an opportunity to bring me back in-house, give me an opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more about how this thing works outside of just writing reports, really trying to get down to the nuts and bolts of what this is really about. And then I did that from 2017 to 2019. 2019, Brian sat me down and said, hey, we want you to take over the department, and I've been doing it ever since.
Why personnel instead of coaching?
Lifestyles are very different. It was funny when I was at the University of Iowa, there were a few coaches that thought that that could be my path. And my thing was seeing their lifestyle and the things that they had to deal with. Me being a former player, I'm like, all right, I know how my teammates were. I knew where my patience lie, and it wasn't in that arena. And then beyond that, it was more so when I dove into just the art form of evaluating talent, that was something that really spoke to me. And it's, that hasn't changed since I left the University of Iowa to where I am today. It's kind of, at its core, like we describe it as an art form, and that's what the essence of what we do is. And yeah, it's just, I just have a strong passion for that, and that's what keeps me going year in and year out. Because every year, like, there's always a collection of players that you'll see. You build your catalog over time, but what happens is that these guys are different. You're trying to figure out their wiring, the types of players. Like, there may be some nuances, some similarities, things of that nature, but at its core, like, it's just that you're evaluating talent. You don't know exactly what that guy is going to be, but you paint a picture of what you hope they become. And then now you have the luxury of seeing that come to fruition or not. And if that's the case, then to understanding why didn't it, to me, that's what brings me back, day in, day out.
Richmond, do you have a biggest influence on your career, the way you go about your job, a biggest influence?
Biggest is a hard thing for me to place. I've had a lot of mentors, a lot of people that have played a strong part in just various elements of my development. Like, I go back to the guy who recruited me out of high school to go to the University of Iowa, Coach Ron Aiken. And I say with him, he taught me what it means to be a man, how you should carry yourself, how you should operate, how he carried his day-to-day interactions with people, how you treat people. That was a really big influence at that stage. And then coming here, one of the first guys that I actually met in person was Reggie McKenzie. And it's in my background, but my brother-in-law, Colin Clode, played here. One of the first people that he introduced me to was Reggie, and it was actually on just happenstance. He had to come to the facility, got me upstairs to the 3rd floor. He didn't know if his code was gonna work. Elevator opens, Reggie's getting ready to leave. He sees me, my brother-in-law introduces me to Reggie. Reggie stops what he's doing and sits down with me for a 2-hour conversation and kind of really broke it down. And it was like, when you see people, like that's uncommon for people to take that kind of time out. And for me, it's just, after getting here and then being able to kind of learn under Reggie and just how he operates and how, again, he treats people, his perspectives, just those things played a big part in terms of just my overall development. But there's been a litany of other people within the Packers organization and outside of it as well that have been instrumental in just my overall growth.
Do you have an overall philosophy about the personnel business? Some guiding principles, shall we say?
I would say at its core, building through the draft is, I know it's something that we talk about all the time, but I truly, truly believe that. When you really start talking about having longevity, being successful over time, not just going through a window of 2 to 3 years where maybe you're good and maybe you're not. A lot of it is like, I think the core foundation of it is when you build through the draft, you're always looking at it through a 3 to 4 year window. And with that, you have, free agency and using these things to kind of help bolster wherever you feel like you're deficient. But ultimately, as you're building through the draft and you're truly believing in drafting and developing players, and again, that more so aligns with a collaborative approach from a coaching and personnel standpoint. Like, I think it's paramount in terms of long-term sustained success. Like, those things to me are critical. And you'll see there's a lot of different ways to do this job. And I wouldn't necessarily, there isn't a right or a wrong, but I personally believe that when you start talking about longevity, that the draft process is critical to that, because that reflects from a salary cap standpoint, when you start talking about the nominal elements of what we do, to keeping that number down. Obviously, when you start, you always want to invest in your own. You want to reward your high performing players, regardless of position. You want to do these things. You want to let the guys know on the roster that, hey, if you come in, you execute, you perform at a high level, that we will reward you for your efforts. But with that, there's always the building, like what I like to call the bridge of you drafting players to, one, help bolster competition at those spots where, yeah, maybe you have a guy that is a fixture, just a known commodity, not only to the fan base, but actually within your locker room. But you always want to have competition. And to me, you always want to have just that sense of urgency that nothing is ever just a guarantee for you in terms of you got to earn every opportunity, like on a year-to-year basis. That's the one thing about this league, is that we see it year in and year out. Like, everything that you did the year before doesn't matter starting tomorrow. Once that next season kicks off, again, it's like you now have to re-earn your name to the rest of the league. You got to re-prove yourself again and again. And I think that's just important in terms of just the overall culture and philosophy of just building a team with using the draft as a part of that.
I know it's a team effort, but at the very, very least, you had a hand in bringing in people like Rasul Douglas, Devondre Campbell, Keyshawn Nixon. When you look at a guy and making the decision whether he's the guy, where do you start?
For us, everything starts with the draft. I think it's very, very important that you have your pro department intertwined with just the entirety of the draft process. So when we go through our draft meetings, the first round, what I do in those meetings is I listen. One, I enjoy just listening to our guys talk about players. Just seeing, like, having the opportunity to have a hand in the development of some of the younger guys and watch them grow throughout the process, and just watching them now be in a position where they are now articulating how they feel about a particular player to the entirety of the room. I say that I'm also taking notes on these players. And essentially what will happen is that as you go through the whole draft process, the draft happens, all these players that you evaluated, obviously you only get so many to bring to your team. well, once that happens, then comes the dynamic of pro scouting. So now you have at least a foundation of what you thought of that player as they were coming into the league. Now you get an opportunity to see how their progression goes throughout their careers. And there's a bevy of different styles and ways to do this. My preference is like, I lean heavily on our guys. Like you said, we all have a hand in, just this entirety of this process. It's important that, from my perspective of listening, when a guy has true conviction about a player that might not always jump off the paper, but when you talk to him, you hear it. And usually when I hear that, I'm writing that name down. And then I'll just kind of just follow guys just through their careers. And you almost get to a point where you're becoming an opportunist. You're just looking for the right scenario where, hey, this guy was a free agent, got signed somewhere else, went there for a 2-year contract, and they just happened to, release the player. And then all of a sudden, he's still out there, and it's very easy to lose track of these guys. But a lot of times for me, it just starts with those initial conversations, that initial draft process, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me to kind of, all right, I'll write this name down here. Let's just see how he progresses throughout his career. And if there's an opportunity where the culture fit is there from the person standpoint, which again, that always dives back to what we originally felt about those guys initially in the draft process. And then the opportunity of just our scheme, like how does this guy fit? If all those things marry up together, then it becomes all right, well, he's available. Maybe we should have contact with the agents to see, hey, what do you got going on? And then we've just been fortunate that, being able to track these guys over time has helped significantly with these guys coming in. And we play a very small part in this whole process. I believe the players go out there, perform, and earn everything that they receive. And guys that you just named, like all those guys, like we've had interest in them at varying levels of their careers. And then there was a window of opportunity to get these players to our roster. But ultimately, they still got to go out there and perform. And those guys were able to do it. So to me, I always tip my hat to those dudes just because of, one, I know their path to where it took them to get to our organization, but also understanding that they know that that nothing is for granted, and they just take advantage of it. And this is a marrying up of, like I said, their skill set, them as people, the culture fit, and just everything that we're going to ask of them. And so far, we've just done a really nice job of doing those things. But it's a very intentional process in order to do it effectively. But at its core, it comes down to, from my perspective, to just listening to our guys and understanding how they truly feel about these players.
Richmond, you played corner and special teams at Iowa. Having played the game at a high level, how does that help you in your current role?
It's huge, actually. Really, when it comes down to, there's certain positions that all of us as scouts, we feel more comfortable watching and evaluating. For myself, it's skilled positions, because I also played receiver growing up. So you just get familiar with just what it takes to be successful on a day in, day out, play in, play out. And for me, that's one of the things I'm always watching whenever I'm scouting a particular player or DB, whatever it may be, is this not only when the point of attack plays, when something's happening at them, but what are they doing when the ball's going away? How are they playing? Is it that sense of urgency? Like, those are the things, when you start talking about the details of the game, that will show up in a good or bad way at our level. And you want to try to isolate and find guys that just have that sense of urgency, that sense of competitiveness, that I'm going to win every rep. And I just think, just relying on my background of not only being a former DB, but like playing with some really good players. Like, I played with Bob Sanders. So just toughness, like, and understanding like what it takes for that guy to be that guy, and then a lot of that goes over to beyond just what you're seeing on film. It's when you get around these young men and listening to them talk, how they compose themselves, how they carry themselves, like all that stuff starts to factor into it. Just when you've had the opportunity to be around players of that caliber, you kind of get an understanding of why they are where they end up, or why they end up being as good as they are. So to me, that's kind of the biggest part of it.
You have a reputation as a, and you know what I mean, quotations, grinder.
Yeah.
How important is good old-fashioned perspiration as opposed to inspiration in your job?
I think it's a healthy combination of both. The one thing that I'll say from my transition from being a college scout to a pro scout was that when you're doing the college, for the most part, the roster doesn't change. It's a little bit different now with the transfer portal. At our level, it changes every day. So the volume of player that you're kind of having to evaluate, that changes on a week-to-week basis. So within that, like, yes, you're grinding tape, but if you're not efficient with your process, you're also restricting your ability to watch other players to make decisions on. And so it's that balance between understanding that, you know, it's important to really dial into the details and know exactly what you're looking for when you're watching tape, but also knowing when to move on to the next guy, and doing it in an efficient process to where the quality of the work doesn't drop off based off just that element of it. So it can be, it was challenging initially, and it's over time when you get more comfortable with the teams. And again, like I kind of referenced, the purpose is when we follow these teams is that you put yourself, your mind in the thought process of the GM of that organization. And you kind of can start to predict or anticipate certain moves that they make that allows you to kind of get a jump on something that may be coming, maybe not this week, but 2 weeks from now. And so when I talk about being more efficient, that kind of coincides with what I mean with that. So,
Richmond, you go through the process, you formulate opinions. Mm-hmm. And once you've gotten to that point, how important is it to have the courage of your own convictions?
Very important. I'll go back to my early years under Ted. When I first got into that draft room for the first time, nobody spoke unless Ted asked you to speak. And you have to find your voice, and it's hard to do in a space where, again, you got Reggie McKenzie, John Dorsey, Alonzo Highsmith, obviously Ted, Brian, John Eric Sullivan, Lee Gibson, like all these guys, and like you're a young guy and you're trying to learn that voice. But a lot of it goes back to the confidence that you have in what you see. Because again, we are giving our opinions on players. And it might be in agreement with, you know, what you're thinking about a player, and might not. But the importance is that is why we're here. And once you understand that, and then you get more comfortable in that setting, and you start to realize that, hey, I have a pretty good feel or eye for something in particular that I think is going to make this guy a real player for us. Like, it makes it a little bit easier over time when you collectively you build your catalog and you continuously see certain traits translate to our level, or guys that you've scouted, you know, as a college guy that you drafted or brought in as a UDFA to your roster, and seeing them have success. Like, it just builds that confidence over time. But initially, yeah, it can be difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And even with our setup now with Brian, he's very like, it's different. It's Ted was, again, like, he wanted to kind of focus in on just the main voices, the area guy, the cross checker, his thoughts. Brian, he kind of has it, for the most part, just an open conversation where, again, out of respect, you always want to listen to the area guy, the cross checker, the guys that have seen the players. These are the ones that initially you want those guys to have the biggest voice because they know them better than anybody else. And then over time, as you kind of get around the player, you get to watch more film, you kind of develop your own opinion, whether that coincides with, you know, what we're thinking initially or it doesn't. But then it gets to a point where you then have the confidence, like, hey, you know, I'm seeing something a little bit different. And then I say that. Ultimately, the GM is who, you know, makes the decisions here. And it's on him to kind of, in these moments, I think the best thing that happens is that if there is a reservation coming from myself or anyone else, that what we do as a staff is, all right, let's pause, let's watch more tape. And then come to a collective decision like, hey, this is where we want to put them. I think ultimately, like, at its core, that is why we're here, is that, you know, again, it's very easy to be in a situation where everybody's in agreement, but a lot of times that doesn't always make you better. And I think when you have those moments where there's guys, and again, these guys have been doing this profession for a long time, like, it's important to listen to their opinions and how they feel, because they may be seeing something that you're not. And taking the moment of, all right, explain why you see what you see or why you feel what you feel. And then let's dive into more tape, more film, let's do more digging to see if like, all right, does our opinion change one way or the other? And sometimes it doesn't, which is fine, but I do think just as being a scout and just knowing that our general manager is willing to do that is a huge thing just from a confidence standpoint, because one is just, it validates just your process, your work that you put into it as well. And I think Brian does an excellent job with us.
I asked Brian about you, and he said you have a great sense for what's going on inside the team, for team dynamics. Where does that come from?
A lot of that will come from just, like I said, my brother-in-law played here. So I was a pseudo Packer before I officially got hired here, because I would come up here in the summers and I would hang out, and I would be around the team. So I was kind of privy to a locker room dynamic that a lot of guys in our profession don't normally get. So just having that perspective, and then having a brother-in-law who played 13 years in the league and kind of seeing his overall progressions, his highs, his lows, and the other things that these guys deal with a lot of times has nothing to do with X's and O's or just pure performance, and understanding how these things can impact those things. And yeah, it just kind of gave me just another layer of insight that a lot of times when there's things going on here that I have the dialogue with some of the guys on our team and just this open conversation. Like hopefully everybody feels the same way. I don't know this, but I feel like guys are comfortable coming to me and just having like conversations, whether it's, hey, what can I do better? Or it has nothing to do with football. Like whether it's talking about marriage or whatever it may be, having kids, whatever, all those things. To me, building that rapport, that trust, and knowing that whatever we speak about, this is just me, Richmond Williams, a scout, giving you my opinion. And them understanding that it's coming from a good place, because ultimately when those guys walk through the door here, like from my perspective, I want to see all these guys succeed. I want to see these guys all be great, because if that happens, we're all doing well. And so anything that I can do where it's just a simple conversation where a guy might be looking a little bummed out because he had a bad day at practice, like, hey, dude, you're doing a nice job. Just focus on the details. Like those little things go a long way in that locker room. And I've just been, again, fortunate enough that my start in the NFL before I actually got hired was being around the locker room. So I would probably link it back to that more than anything else.
Not surprisingly, after your comments, Brian also said you were a great listener. He nailed that, didn't he?
It is important for sure. I'll say this, like, this is reflecting back on the conversation about people who have an impact on you. Again, with Reggie, that was one of the things that, like, seeing him, he didn't speak a lot, but when he spoke, everybody listened. But the one thing about him is that he did a really good job of just processing the information and listening to every part of it, and truly like taking in what these guys are saying, because ultimately at its core, we all want to have success. We all want to see this team grow and win games. And that just kind of, just seeing that, and not only in him, but in some other guys like Elliot, who did a fantastic job as part of something. That's one of my really good friends, Elliot Wolf. Understanding that, like, it's not always about being right. It's about getting it right for the organization. And with that, like, you have to humble yourself that, okay, my opinion does not mean that it is the accurate one. If somebody sees something differently, let me take in why, listen, understand, and then go do my own due diligence and dive into the player, whatever it may be, and then we can have a conversation about it. And then transforming into this particular role that I'm in now, like, so much of it is one man can't do all this work by themselves. We have to kind of, I have to rely on others, and I have to trust that, like, it is just as important to them as it is to me, which I know that with the staff, that when they, grade a player, when I see that, I don't have to go second guess that guy. I'll go have a conversation to kind of get a feel for how much you like the guy. Because again, a lot of that is a part of how we present it to Brian. Because ultimately, from my role in particular, and I work with John Wojciechowski, we have a lot of conversations about when there's a particular situation where there's an injury that we didn't plan for or something unexpected happens with the roster, we sit down, we talk, and we try to build a collection of options. And what we do is present these options to Brian and say, hey, this might be the most expensive option that will help right away, but we don't know which route he wants to go. But the importance of it is allowing him to be able to see through, filter through the best of what we have available at that time. And a huge part of that is just trusting the guys that you work with and then listening to them when they speak with conviction about a player.
Richmond, most satisfying part of your job?
That is a great question, and it's funny. It's kind of a twofold thing for me. I would say winning a Super Bowl was probably by far the most satisfying part of my job, but the one thing that I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and we were talking about just fulfillment. Like what do you get fulfillment out of? And just really thinking about it, to me it's playing a part in the development of our young guys is just overall growth and path. Like, it's not about my own personal accolades. Like, I'm obviously appreciative of whatever comes my way, but like what I get fulfillment out of is just seeing the development of those young guys and knowing that, you know what, I had a small piece to play in that. Beyond anything else, I think is probably what I walk away with, just the most happiness out of what I do.
Thank you, Richmond.
Thank you, sir.
Richmond Williams, one of the Packers' unsung heroes.